I'd like to call the meeting back to order. Just a reminder to everyone, this is televised in case any of you were not aware of this. And our next presenter is Salim Mansour. He's a professor of political science at the University of Western Ontario. And Salim, you have 10 minutes to make your presentation, and then you will have time for questions. Not you will have time for questions. The committee will have time to ask you questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And honourable members, many thanks for inviting me to share my thoughts with this Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. I appear before you as a common citizen, deeply apprehensive and concerned about the drift of our country as it changes due to the rate of immigration that is without precedent among any of the advanced liberal democracies of the West. My expertise, or to the extent my expertise is recognized by this committee for which I have been invited to appear before you, is that of a professional academic, a researcher, writer, author, and public intellectual of some recognition in this great country of ours, and I'm proud and humbled to come before you as an unhyphenated Canadian. Let me state right at the outset, before I share with you my perspective on immigration, I support all measures under consideration that modern technology provides for securing our borders, monitoring those who seek to gain entry into Canada, those who arrive here without proper documentation and claim refugee status, and those in legions outside of Canada who want to come here as immigrants. I believe it is a no-brainer to work towards a more secure Canada and to implement smart cards, biometric systems, and other tools available now or will be in the future. I have no doubt on this matter that were we to have the thoughts of our founding fathers inform us, and those remarkable leaders who have come after them, such as Laurier and King, Pearson and Trudeau, Knowles and Douglas, they would remind us that a constitution agreed upon by a free people to provide for, as John A. Macdonald put it, peace, order, and good government is not a suicide pact. In the small amount of time I have before you, I want to stress upon the first principle behind the immigration policy as it has evolved since the centennial year and presently stand. Needless to remark that Canada is an immigrant country, and our history tells us that we should know it has been immigrants from Europe over the past several centuries that have built this country. On the whole, they built it well, and indeed so well that Canada has come to be an eagerly sought country for people from around the world, as I did. But, and here's the point, at some stage of Canada's historical development since at least 1867, those who built Canada in the early years of its history could have reached an agreement to close the door to immigration. They did not. They believed the strength of the country would be maintained through a judicious policy of accepting new immigrants from Europe. The key point here I want to emphasize, and I have written about this at length in the public media, is they all believe that immigration judiciously and carefully managed, I emphasize managed, in terms of numbers and source of origin of immigrants should be such that the nature of Canada as a liberal democracy is not undermined. It is numbers, and the nature of numbers that matter, and given the nature of things, determines how existing arrangements are secured or undermined. Since the open-door immigration policy was instituted around the time of Canada's centennial year, the nature of immigration into Canada started to change from what had been the pattern since before 1867 to around 1960. During the past 50 years, immigration from outside of Europe, from what is generally designated the Third World, has rapidly increased in proportion to those immigrants originating in Europe. Furthermore, given the revolution in transportation with the introduction of wide-body transcontinental jetliner that has made mass travel economical and easy, the distinction between immigrant and migrant workers has been eliminated. This means, and it is not simply in reference to ethnicity, that Canada is rapidly changing culturally in ways a political elite, media elite, and academic elite do not want to discuss. But the fact that this is not discussed or driven under the carpet does not mean the public is not keenly aware of how much the country has changed in great measure in a relatively short period. And if this pattern continues for another few decades, there is the likelihood that Canada will have changed irrevocably and not necessarily for the better in terms of its political tradition as a liberal democracy. So, in terms of first principle, we need a governing institution, and those individuals we as Canadians sent to represent us to boldly re-examine our existing immigration policy and rethink it in terms of what it represents and how it will affect the well-being of Canada in the years to come. I do not need to remind you that any set of policy, however benign or good the intent is behind the making of such policy, is riddled with unintended consequences. History is a paradox. What you intend is not how things turn out in the long run, and not even in the short term. Pick any example you want and think it through and see for yourself the paradoxical nature of history and how it surprises us by confounding our expectations. I have at hand the recent publication of Statistics Canada, Projection of the Diversity of the Canadian Population, 2006 to 2031. In other words, this projection affects me and what remains of my life, but more importantly affects my children, my students, my friends and neighbors. Your views as our representatives are critical and will affect all of us, and you will be responsible in terms of history if you take your place in these hallowed halls with the seriousness it demands for the good and the bad that come out of your decisions. Let me quickly, time permitting, point from this Statistics Canada publication the following. 1. Given the nature of our immigration policy, since 1960, the foreign-born population is growing about 4 times faster than the rest of the population. Consequently, in 2031, there will be between 9.8 million and 12.5 million foreign-born persons compared to 6.5 million in 2006, and the corresponding number in 1981 was 3.8 million. According to Statistics Canada projection, the population estimated for 2031 will be around 45 million, with 32%, around 14.5 million people will be foreign-born. 3. One more interesting and yet critical figure is the cultural religious makeup of Canada in 2031. The fastest growth, according to the report, is the Muslim population, quote-unquote, with its numbers tripling during this period. This increase is mainly due to 2 factors, the composition of immigration and higher fertility than for other groups. The figures are for Muslims in 2006 at around 900,000, constituting 2.7% of the population, and rising to 2031 around 3.3 million, constituting 7.3% of the population. If the levels of immigration in Canada is being maintained and defended on the basis of the need to deal with the problems of Canadian society in terms of aging population, fertility rates among Canadian women, skilled labor management requirement, and maintaining a growth level for the population consistent with the growth of the economy, then this policy needs to be reevaluated. We cannot fix the social problems of the Canadian society by an open immigration policy that adds to the numbers at a rate that puts into question the absorptive capacity of the country, not only in economic terms, but also, if not more importantly, in cultural and social terms, and what this does to our political arrangement as a liberal democracy. The flow of immigration into Canada from around the world, and in particular the flow from Muslim countries, means the pouring in of numbers into a liberal society of people from cultures at best non-liberal. But we know through our studies and observation that the illiberal mix of cultures poses one of the greatest dilemmas and an unprecedented challenge to liberal societies such as ours, when there is no demand placed on immigrants any longer to assimilate into the founding liberal values of the country to which they have immigrated to, and instead, by a misguided and thoroughly wrong-headed policy of multiculturalism, encourage the opposite. It is no wonder that recently the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the British Prime Minister David Cameron, among other European leaders, and a growing body of intellectuals have spoken out in public against multiculturalism and the need to push it back, even repeal it. I have written a book on the wrong-headed policy of multiculturalism and published recently under the title Delectable Lie, A Liberal Repudiation of Multiculturalism. Time forbids me to discuss this matter in any length, but I would like to leave the following paradox with you. We may want to continue with the level of immigration into Canada annually that is about the same as it is at present. We cannot, however, continue with such an inflow of immigrants under the present arrangement of the official policy of multiculturalism based on the premise all cultures are equal, when this is untrue, and that this policy is a severe, perhaps even a lethal, test for liberal democracy such as ours. This means we cannot simultaneously continue with both the existing level of immigration and official multiculturalism, and must choose one or the other for the preservation of our liberal democratic traditions. If we persist, we will severely undermine a liberal democracy or what remains of it, compromise the foundation of individual freedom by accommodating group rights, and bequeath to our children and unborn generation a political situation fraught with explosive potential for ethnic violence, the sort of which we have seen in Europe, in the riots in the banlieue or suburbs of Paris and other metropolitan centers. In conclusion, I want to emphasize we need to consider lowering the number of immigrants entering into Canada until we've had a serious debate among Canadians on this matter. We should not allow bureaucratic inertia determining not only the policy, but the existing level of immigrant numbers and source within origin that Canada brings in annually. We have the precedent of how we selectively closed immigration from the Soviet bloc countries during the Cold War years, and we need to consider doing the same in terms of immigration from Muslim countries for a period of time, given how disruptive the cultural baggage of illiberal values is brought in as a result. We are, in other words, stoking the fuel of much unrest in our country, as we have witnessed of late in Europe. And lest any member wants to instruct me that my views are in any way politically incorrect or worse, I would like members to know that I come before you as a practicing Muslim who know out of experience from the inside how volatile, how disruptive, how violent, how misogynistic is the culture of Islam today and has been during my lifetime, and how it greatly threatens our liberal democracy that I cherish, since I know what is its opposite. Thank you.